A big step towards normalcy today. For the first time since the pandemic started, Ontario lifted its mask mandate in most public spaces, including shops, restaurants, and schools. Some GTA school boards, including the TDSB, had expressed concern over this change, asking the province to keep the mandate in place for a few more weeks, especially since this was the first day back since March break. But the province rejected those calls. So how did it go inside classrooms today? And did lifting the mask mandate really change public behavior? Joining us to discuss tonight is Jason Bradshaw, secondary school science teacher with Peel District School Board, Sophia Alexanian with Ontario Students for COVID Safety, and Dr. Andrew Buzari, a primary care physician and executive director of social medicine at UHM. Thanks to all of you. Jason, let's start with you. Tell us a bit about what you saw in your school today in Brampton.
Well, in my school, I would say that behaviors hadn't changed very much compared to what we saw before the break. When I looked at my classroom and other classrooms that I visited, and when I looked at staff in the school, almost everyone was still wearing masks. Throughout my entire day, I interacted with maybe about 100 students, and I would say that only about 5 or 6 were not wearing masks. And as far as staff are concerned, only maybe 2 or 3 staff members out of about 20 or so I may have interacted with today were not wearing masks. So I know it varies a lot depending on location and community and even the grade level of the school. But in my school, I would say that the behavior has still pretty much been consistent with what was happening before the break.
Okay, Sophia, is that news sort of a relief to you? Of course, you were part of this group of students that staged a walkout over this today. Talk us through some of your concerns and how you felt going back to school today without that mask mandate in place.
Well, students have been through a lot. We've been through a lot of learning disruptions due to COVID cases in schools, which still aren't being reported. That's another point. But we've been through a lot, so it is really important to have those layers of protection, which includes masking. So there was some anxiety. You know, I was talking to kids from across Ontario, and I was very fortunate in my school, pretty similar. We had a very strong masking culture. Most students were wearing masks. I felt very comfortable due to that. But I'm talking to kids where that's not the case, and it is a serious risk to them.
So, Dr. Buzari, does the vaccination rate among children support unmasking in schools? What's your guidance on this?
Yeah, you know, it's great to hear the frontline experience and the leadership from Jason and Sophia, just again about what is playing out with respect to the measures being lifted. I think when we look at the evidence, it's been really clear. Again, there's been some recent evaluations done just about how effective masks have been in reducing transmissions within schools. I think, again, when we think about where we are at this juncture in the pandemic of 2 years in, but also just about March break, people traveling, coming back, the weather still seeing a lot of things having to happen indoors. So really where there's significant evidence for masking to be able to reduce transmission with not a huge amount of costs, it's really something where we think we've got to see some continuation of this till we can get to a different point in the pandemic. And again, to see the fact that, students are, voting with their feet around masks and the evidence is obviously really encouraging.
Jason, I want to ask you a bit about this because I saw one TDSB teacher suggest on Twitter classrooms should have a segregated seating plan, sort of separating masked and unmasked students. Obviously, that's not actually going to happen, but are you concerned about students being bullied or treated differently over this choice?
Yes, I am concerned that we could see that even educators with very good intentions might make poor decisions like what you just described. Obviously, we shouldn't be treating students differently depending on whether they choose to wear masks or not. Even if you feel like you're doing that to protect other students. I mean, realistically, COVID is an airborne illness. It's not going to make a difference in my understanding if a student is seated just a little bit away from another student because they're not wearing a mask. Ideally, the best protection, I would guess, would be for us to be continuing to wear masks, but we can't be segregating students in that way. Fortunately, as I've mentioned, at my school, we've had most students continuing to mask, and I haven't seen anyone give anybody any difficulty based on whether they decided to mask or not mask. Everyone has been completely open to people's decisions, and no one has been treated differently in what I saw today. based on what their choice was.
Sophia, I wonder what your experience or your perspective on that question is.
Well, yeah, I agree that schools should be an inclusive, safe environment for everyone, regardless of the choices they're making with the lifting of restrictions. So at my school, I don't have a lot of unmasked peers, but from what I've witnessed, people are treating everyone the same as usual. So I don't see it as an issue.
That's great to hear. Dr. Buzari, we know the pandemic obviously had an unequitable impact on families. Does lifting the mask mandate, in your perspective, sort of exacerbate any of those inequities?
Yeah, it's a great point, and great to hear, from Sophia that there isn't this kind of segregation or any sort of pushing towards people who are choosing to wear masks or not wear masks. But when we look at the data around the risks in schools are definitely not equal. And I think, as Jason has mentioned, there's really important issues around air quality and the ventilation aspects that have to be in place when we're dealing with an airborne disease. But also when you look at the most recent data when it comes to vaccination rates, we're seeing 2 to 3-fold differences in vaccination rates in schools across the city, where we know it's coming across the lines of socioeconomic status, of poverty, of schools in neighborhoods that do not have as good access as some schools in more affluent neighborhoods. And this is where we see this real compounding of risk. And I think to the point that you make, that removing mask mandates will not have the same effect in certain places, especially when some schools are safer. And we've seen this disparity as well, where many private schools are going to continue with the mask mandates, have higher vaccination rates and lower COVID spread in those neighborhoods. And this is what we're really concerned about, is these measures can actually widen the gap.
So, Jason, to this point about location, because you brought that up right at the start of this chat as well, would you have preferred to see sort of a regional approach to lifting this mandate?
Ideally, I think it's too soon to raise the mandate at all. But given that, of course, there are discrepancies between regions, I do think that school boards should be empowered to make their own calls about how they want to move forward. I know that some school boards, such as the TDSB, have requested that privilege, and they've been denied, which is somewhat ironic to me when private schools do have that privilege. So there's definitely a discrepancy, and there's definitely an inequity in how this is being carried out and implemented between different communities, between different social economic groups, and definitely between public versus private schools.
So, Sophia, let me ask you this. If the large majority of students and teachers are masked in schools, which is what we saw happen today, does the mandate matter?
Well, that's just from our experiences. I was talking to kids across Ontario, and there are places where, about half of the people are unmasked. And I'm no public health expert. I don't know what level it is where it's a large enough portion of unmasked people to present a threat that the masking is no longer, the universal masking is no longer effective as preventing transmission. So I still think it's important to have that guideline. If masking is still needed at this point of the pandemic, that leadership should come from above, that it is still needed.
Yeah, that's a great point. Dr. Buzari, let's ask you that question. We've been also tracking the BA2 subvariant. I mean, how concerned should we be about all this? At what point do we say we don't need the mask at all, anywhere? And I mean, could we see any of these restrictions reimposed?
Yeah, and I think when we look at what's been happening with the BA2 subvariant, looking at what's happening in different jurisdictions, I think this is really the feel when we're looking at the evidence that this does feel very early. I think, again, everyone is tired and has sacrificed so much throughout the pandemic, and we want to see us move to a more equitable place where there isn't this sort of spread, and this is not causing the devastating impact that COVID has. And so when we look at some jurisdictions which have raised or lifted their mask mandates, they've actually had to return, especially in Austria and other regions, to ensuring that they have a mask mandate just because of what's happening in terms of their case numbers. I mean, I think it's really important to see that it may play out differently given the Omicron wave that we've had in Canada and in Ontario. So there's still just a lot of uncertainty. And again, for something where there is not a huge amount of cost to be able to keep this in place. And I think Sophia makes a really brilliant point in the fact that the guidance can seem confusing when public health officials are asked about it. They're saying, well, they're going to continue to wear masks, but maybe people will be left to their own choices. But again, we know that this drives real inequities and that not everyone has the same risk. And we're going to have a collective approach to get through this pandemic.
Sophia, I just want to give you the last word here very quickly. Do you feel safe going back to school tomorrow?
Well, I'm very lucky. Like I said, my school has a high level of masking. We had a great turnout at the walkout, lots of really good energy. So personally, I do feel safe, and I'm very privileged to feel that way. But I'm concerned for all of my friends across the province, all of my friends in other schools who are not in the same scenario.
Some really important points there. Thanks so much for your time to all of you. Jason Bradshaw, Sophia Alexanian, and Dr. Andrew Bazari, thank you.